Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. This morning we were in Mozambique. We're going across the border to Zimbabwe. And we have a spokesperson speaking to us from the southern part of the country, Bulawayo, who will be discussing with us what the situation is there. For security reasons, she won't be appearing on the camera. The Ukuthula Trust has produced an extraordinary report about arrests and tests in Bulawayo, pointing out that there have been many more arrests than there have been tests carried out in the time of coronavirus. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us. Perhaps we might start with helping some of our viewers who may not know about where Bulawayo is and its particular history. Would you be willing to do that, please?
Yes, sure. And thanks, Feroz. It's a pleasure to be chatting to everybody today. And Bulawayo is Zimbabwe's second largest city. Harare is the capital, and that's the place most people are familiar with. Bulawayo is in the west of the country, and it's situated in 3 provinces of the country out of 10, Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South, and Bulawayo, where the Ndebele ethnic group predominates. And there's a long history of sort of persecution and marginalization of this part of the country, which had its roots in the colonial era and in the War of Liberation, when 2 different liberation armies fought for independence in Zimbabwe. And Joshua Nkomo was the very widely loved leader from this half of the country. And he headed a political party known as ZAPU, and Robert Mugabe, of course, was the head of ZANU. And as we know, in the first election, ZANU won all the seats in the other 10, in the other provinces, and all the seats in the west of the country were won by Joshua Nkomo's party. And this, plus a sort of a history of antagonism during the Liberation War, led to a mini genocide here, beginning in 1983, which was 3 years post-independence, and continuing really, off and on until the signing of something called the Unity Accord in 1987. And many thousands of civilians were massacred during that time. And there are many mass graves in this region to this day. And this is very much, it's a very silent history. It's a history which the country is still struggling in many ways to come to terms with. And one of the complaints which you often hear in this region is that the marginalization is still felt in many ways. That a lot of people holding senior positions in this country aren't Ndebele speaking, they're Shona speaking, for example. And that, the people here have a sense of having less access to resources. Of course, in some ways that may be a perception, because at this stage, nobody in Zimbabwe is getting service delivery. Nobody in Zimbabwe is seeing development of infrastructure, because we were in a dire economic and political situation even prior to the impact of COVID. Currently, we have around 700% inflation. And, we have real problems at, all sorts of levels. The country is broke, basically, and our currency is pretty much valueless. So, just broadly speaking, that's the situation. The whole country is in a dire situation, but there's a perception in Matabeleland that we in particular are suffering from a particular lack of resources in relation to COVID-19.
Right. One of the things that we hear from a number of people who we've interviewed on this program, that across the continent, what we are seeing is that the virus has helped lift the veil from our eyes to begin to understand much better the degree of social differentiation, the impoverishment, the way that we're not all in the same boat, that people are absolutely the virus is hitting people in a way that really reflects the underlying social differences in society. Is this what you're seeing today in Bulawayo and Matabeleland?
Sure. I think, for example, as I speak, there's still in Matabeleland is not a single really functional COVID-19 ready ward in this entire part of the country. And Bulawayo is the referral center for hospitals in 5 provinces, not just the 3 Matabeleland provinces, but also Midlands and Masvingoand. And yet we do not have a sort of a ward which would be able to accept extremely ill patients. One of the things which I think we're very fortunate about at some level is that the impact of COVID has been slower here than we had originally expected. As you know, just across the border in South Africa, there's now 250,000 COVID positive people. In Zimbabwe, that's supposedly just crossed the 1,000 barrier, but we are performing way fewer tests than we should. So we really don't have a handle on the scale of the virus. But what we can say is, if it was very widespread, we would be seeing hospitals filling with critically ill patients, and we would see people dying of unexplained deaths, in rural areas. And to date, that really does not seem to be the case. But we also know that there are more local transmissions taking place now than imported infections, because for a long time, the majority of people testing COVID positive were returnees, particularly from South Africa. But now what we're starting to see is that it's community transmission, which is starting to get a hold. And we've also had a lot of health professionals testing positive. As I speak, we've had more than 40 health workers positive out of those 1,000. And we have 300 health workers who are in self-isolation at the moment pending results. So, this on top of the constraints which we have in the health sector, which includes nurses being on strike because they're working for about $20 a month at the moment in real terms. And they don't have proper PPE, they don't have proper protection, and they're saying, why are we putting our lives on the line for a few US where we can't even pay our rent? So, the health system, that's one of the things which has been revealed in terms of, we were already in a state of crisis in terms of lack of resources for the health sector. And COVID has just really served to underline this.
Right. So what is the policy of the government in relation to COVID? What's happening?
Well, that's a good question. We are supposedly in some kind of lockdown. Again, I'm not sure that lockdown is the right approach, for developing nations like our own, where we have more than 90% of people in Zimbabwe who survive in the informal sector, which means they are self-employed at one level or another. 90% more than, in a dire situation of hyperinflation and so on. And so to tell people we're in lockdown, stay home and don't go out and earn a living, is a very tough message to put out there or to enforce. And so it's being poorly enforced. And, town is as busy as I've ever seen it, on the very few occasions, when I've been into the center of town. So theoretically, there's a lockdown. But in practice, what we're finding is that lockdown is simply used to repress people idiosyncratically, sort of unpredictably, and isn't very effective in terms of ensuring social distance. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that, in this situation. I mean, for example, in Bulawayo right now, we have 144 hours a week of no water. 144 hours a week with no water in a city that has 1 million people. Which means effectively you get water for 12 hours twice a week. And so this means there are massive water queues everywhere. People get up in the small hours of the morning and stand with their 20-liter buckets waiting for some bowser that comes, in the middle of the afternoon so that everyone can get their 20 liters of water. And these are crowded queues, which means that we also have typhoid in Bulawayo at the moment. We've had 1,500 people ill in one suburb with what is sort of acknowledged to have been typhoid, but not very clearly. The Bulawayo City Council hasn't really issued a very clear statement. But we've heard in terms of some autopsy reports, because we've had about 13 deaths as well, that this is typhoid. And then on top of that, just in the last few days, there have been reports of pellagra, which is linked to malnutrition. The City Council, yes, the City Council is saying, well, this is malnutrition, which is a way of them trying to say this isn't linked to the typhoid or to the gastrointestinal disorders, which, have affected more than 1,000 people now. But, for me, they could well be linked. I mean, if you've got a gastrointestinal disorder for weeks on end, you're going to end up with malnutrition. If you can't keep food in, you're going to end up with vitamin deficiencies and, all sorts of associated disorders. So it's really dire. I mean, the suffering and deprivation here is absolutely dire. And I don't know how many people in the world know there's a typhoid outbreak going on in Zimbabwe right now.
I suspect that. I mean, I've not read any reports on that while I was researching for this program. That's really worrying. But you're saying Bulawayo is crowded because what's happening in many countries. We were talking to people in India a couple of weeks ago that in fact small farmers are unable to get their products to the market, and so are suffering because they've got no income and so on. And concurrently in the cities, the people they're starving because they can't find food, or it's very expensive because that normal channel of food is not coming in. Is there a parallel with Bulawayo, or is it a different situation?
It's a bit of a different situation simply because we're also in the middle of a dire drought, okay, which is why we've got no water in our supply dams, which means that very few people in this region grew crops this year. Although it is the case in some other parts of Zimbabwe that there's problems with farmers getting crops to market. But in our part of the country, we're not really a crop growing part of the country anyway. It's more livestock. We more have sort of communal cattle and goats in this part of the country. But they're struggling because the grazing is all gone. I mean, I was out in a rural area yesterday and it's just bare earth. It looks like October. The landscape is what we expect in October, and we've still got months to go. If we're lucky, the rains will come in November or more likely December. And there's just no grazing out there. And then to make things worse, there was a bumper year of amacimbi this year, which is the mapani worm, which is a delicacy here, and it's also a cash crop. So, that was an advantage, for a short space of time, except that people who were harvesting the mapani worms were having to barter them with people who weren't paying a fair exchange. And the mapani worms are now gone. And sadly, so are all the leaves on the mapani trees, because the cattle in Matabeleland have learnt to browse in order to stay alive. They don't just graze, they eat the mapani trees, which are very nutritious. But those are now bare as well because the worms ate all the leaves. So it's really a dire situation that we're looking at. And in terms of food supply, one of the system which works extremely well, especially in Matabeleland, is what we call the system of Omalaicha. And Omalaicha is a Sindebele word meaning those who carry. And those who carry are people from this region who are based in Johannesburg and who buy groceries from people who have jobs in the diaspora and then bring them home and deliver them to grannies and children living in rural Zimbabwe. And it's actually normally a fantastic system. I'm so full of admiration for that system because it's a diaspora way of getting remittances back into the country in kind and delivering it right to the door, to the most remote rural homestead in the middle of Chilocho or Gwanda. And you'll see this 4x4, toppling along, with wardrobes and 50 kg mealie meal and bicycles and all of these things, which get delivered straight to the homestead. It's a fantastic system. And that has stopped. That has stopped because the border has closed, because of COVID-19.
Right. But
the South African border is closed and the Botswana borders are closed. So it's very, that system has largely collapsed.
Right. Somebody was telling me in Harare that they've changed the mobile banking situation. Has that affected people in Bulawayo as well?
Yes, that's been dire because that is really the main way that people get money in this country. I mean, the government itself will acknowledge that 87% of transactions are by mobile phone. And more than 90% of those transactions are by one mobile phone provider called Equinet. And the whole system has been shut down. Now, what do you do if you're in some rural area? There's no bank, there's nowhere to draw money. The vast majority of people in this country have no bank account. Their only form of digital currency is via the mobile banking system. And the government has shut this down, or it's largely constrained it. It's kind of hobbling along. But there's a huge limit on numbers of transactions that one can do. And this is to try and control the grey market, the money market, because, there's an official rate for the US dollar, and then there's the real rate for the US dollar, if you like. And, people will hand over $100 cash, and then they'll be paid in EcoCash onto their phone. So it's to try and stop that process going on. But it's just, I'm sure that that's true, that there are a lot of people who are exploiting the black market in that way. But that's a tiny proportion of the number of people who use Equinet every day. And yet, so, it's affected, according to Equinet, they have over 1 million users. No, sorry, what was it? Over 10 million users, I think they said.
Wow.
On the system. I think the correct figure is 10 million. So, it's just crazy that to shut down that many customers, it's kind of a sledgehammer approach to trying to manage the black market.
So when you talk about the repression, the arrests and so on, is what is happening just a continuity of what was happening anyway, or do you see this an escalation of some kind?
I think it's both. This is a country which has been ruled by various levels of repression, well, for the last 100 years, really, back to colonial days. And certainly here in Matabeleland, there were no halcyon days after independence because we had Gokorohundi, we had the massacres. When other parts of Zimbabwe definitely did get development, there were schools being built and clinics, there was much which ZANU-PF did right in large parts of the country in the 1980s. But not the whole country benefited from that era. In some parts of the country, there were massacres going on at the same time. So there's always been this a way of dealing with political opposition via repressive legislation and just stamping, on the opposition. Which is continuing to date. So, there's kind of a triple whammy, if you like, for people in the country right now. The one is the starvation and the fact that the COVID-19 lockdown has almost, outlawed a lot of people's sources of income. So fear of starvation is number one, and then fear of the police and that there's going to be clampdowns, and this is intermittent. At one stage there were very strict police roadblocks. At the moment, those have vanished, even though in theory the laws are still there. But it's this unpredictability where you can wake up one day and the roadblocks are back and the repression is back. So that's the second concern. And then the third concern is the virus, but it's very much a third concern at the moment. The day-to-day problem is, how do we put food on the table? And that is the biggest dilemma.
So what does organizing mean under these conditions?
It's extremely difficult, as it is, anywhere else. And then to make things more difficult is very few people here have access to data, because of course you could say, well, the world has become a smaller place in many ways. Here I am talking to you, and people from all over the world can listen in. We've discovered the wonders of Zoom and streaming, but that doesn't help, the vast majority of people here in Zimbabwe who either have very poor internet or no internet in terms of access to data. And in any case in Zimbabwe, even prior to this, organizing has been difficult. There was a horrible case earlier this year, which was in Harare, not here, where a couple of women who demonstrated on behalf of the hungry in one of the Harare suburbs were abducted and tortured by some kind of weird third force. So this is what happens when you try to organize and protest here. So the problem is that COVID-19 laws are being used to outlaw, attempts to organize and meet. Although, they've pretty much have been difficult, regardless of COVID-19, for a long time in this country.
So are there no cracks which let the light in, as Leonard Cohen would put it?
I have to be honest. At the moment in Zimbabwe, it's looking like mostly tunnel and not much light. My biggest fear is that the virus is much more widely spread than we realize. And of course, as we know, young people don't necessarily show symptoms in the way that an older population does. And perhaps we should consider ourselves lucky in Zimbabwe that only 3 to 5% of our population is in the high-risk age group for coronavirus. But even so, I'm worried that soon we're going to see that population starting to, become very, very ill, and we're not going to have the capacity to offer services to them, because really, when you hear that a city like Johannesburg with all its resources is currently battling for oxygen, I wonder what's going to happen in a city like Bulawayo, where we don't actually have a single functioning oxygenated ward, operating as I speak to you. So I think we're in for bleak times. I think, and I don't see why we should be so special. When South Africa has been this badly affected, we've seen it's taken a long time. Here we are, it's July. It's taken from March till July to really peak in Johannesburg. And, I can see us being a month or two behind Johannesburg. But so many of our Zimbabweans have returned. They've returned in their thousands from Johannesburg, and they're still doing so every day. In fact, I was talking to someone in civics today who said that as we were talking at 4 o'clock this afternoon, he was receiving WhatsApps to say there's a busload of returnees from Johannesburg on their way into Bulawayo this afternoon, and there are no quarantine centers functioning in Bulawayo at the moment. Because they were using educational centers, and now they're wanting to reopen all the schools and colleges. And there's sort of 1 or 2 hotels who are supposed to be receiving people into quarantine, but that's already creaking at the seams in terms of occupancy, and also in terms of patients, because I think these hospitals have been promised $90 per person per day, and of course so far they haven't been paid. So how long is that system going to operate? So it's a real crisis with these returnees coming in, that they're being told they have to be in quarantine, but the quarantine facilities have been dire. They've been really inadequate. And now they're not even existent to the same extent as before, because of the fact that they were educational institutions, and they're not allowed to use these institutions anymore. So, I just feel, why should we think that the virus isn't going to really dig in here? It may still take another month or 6 weeks, but we're going to see an absolute wave of sickness in this country.
Right. And now with typhoid, you're saying, developing.
Yeah, typhoid has claimed almost as many lives. I mean, it's claimed 13 in the last couple of weeks, and so far we have supposedly had 19 COVID deaths.
So are there adequate health facilities for that?
Well, I mean, it's very problematic because there's so many nurses on strike and so on. I think the City Council has been providing medication free through the Luveve clinic, and they have sort of put mobile clinics into the suburb, which is severely affected at this time. And I do know that international donors are aware and that there are efforts. I know that various organizations are literally bringing in fresh water by Bowser to try and provide, some relief for citizens. But it's all a very threadbare kind of a response, like everything, in Zimbabwe right now.
I mean, this is, really depressing, given that Zimbabwe for many years had this reputation in the health sector of being really progressive and really reaching out and with primary healthcare facilities and so on. Has that all fallen apart?
Well, it's creaking at the seams. Look, I mean, I think the Ministry of Health itself knows exactly what's expected of it at this time in terms of how it should be dealing, with the virus. They know they should be doing more widespread testing. It's not a lack of knowing that this is what they should be doing. They know that they should be preparing wards. But the question is, they are just, the point is they're just not getting, the resources. And in that, they're probably not that different to many other countries in this part of the world. I mean, all over the world, countries have struggled to test on the scale that they should because there just haven't been the tests available. There just haven't been the ventilators available. There just hasn't been the oxygen available. And we're just seeing it, more extreme in a country which in the last couple of years has really allowed the health system, to be under-resourced.
Yeah. So, I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just going to say, so I just want to say it's not that people here don't have the know-how. What we don't have is the resources, to put it all together and make it work at this time.
So what happened to all the money that these generals and so on made in the raids into the Congo?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I'm the wrong person to ask. I have no idea.
Indeed. So any particular message you would like to get across to people who are watching this or will be watching this?
Well, I mean, I think, that Zimbabwe perhaps just raises many of the same questions that other developing nations raise. We're all learning from coronavirus. We don't know. I mean, I don't know that any country in the world has been fantastic. Maybe a few, maybe the Scandinavian countries, maybe New Zealand, which has the advantage of being an island. But it's very difficult to know what should one do in a context where you have 90% of people in the informal sector. How do they protect themselves? How do they socially distance? How do they earn a living? And how do they keep safe from this virus? I mean, these are very unanswerable or very difficult questions. But in a state like ours, you can't tell people to socially distance and then offer absolutely no social welfare network, which is pretty much the reality here. I think people have had something like the equivalent of $2 in real terms, in terms of support. Something like 200 bond, which is literally worth about $2. And you can't, that is no substitute for being allowed to go out and try and earn a living. But on the other hand, we do have to shelter our elderly and our vulnerable. And, on top of that, we've got hunger, we've got issues with water. People are being told to wash their hands and there isn't any water. So it's I'm sure that there are other countries, also facing such difficult situations, and including probably in parts of Asia, where people live in crowded conditions and don't have a lot of resources within families to cope.
Well, indeed. Although, there are, you mentioned New Zealand, but there's also South Korea, which is almost totally controlled. Vietnam have completely controlled the spread of the virus, as has the state of Kerala in South India.
Yes,
So these are not. The knowledge for doing that is there.
yes, I think
worthwhile looking.
What those all have in common is sort of functioning central governments, and perhaps lacking.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are lots of functioning.
Thing as a state, I mean, it sort of has always had a different way in the world, hasn't it, to other parts?
Yeah. But I mean, you have such contrasting countries: Vietnam, you have South Korea, you have New Zealand, you have Kerala, and it's quite striking. They're very different political systems, very different ways of organizing, very different population profiles, and yet it can be managed. But anyway, but it's not happening in Bulawayo and in Matabeleland, which is a real tragedy. And it's shocking to hear that there's no water, there's no air, and typhoid fever is beginning to happen. So yeah, but I hope that somewhere the cracks will appear that let the light in. And but for the moment, I wish you all the best, and hope you manage to take care of yourself, your family, and the struggle continues, I guess.
Yes, thanks very much, Feroz. That's all true. And yes, the struggle continues. And, they say it's darkest before dawn. So we've been saying that a long time in Zimbabwe, but hopefully the dawn is coming.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Well, thank you very much for sparing time to talk with us. I really appreciate that. We very rarely get news from Bulawayo and Matabeleland, so this is very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, you take care, and I hope we'll be in touch again in due course.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. This is Feroz Manji from the Raja Press signing off today on Organising in the Time of COVID-19. Thank you for joining us today.